Okay, so here we are, final chapter that we'll be covering for the semester. Again, this whole kind of last third of the semester, right between exam 2 and exam 3, we focus primarily on the nervous system. And so the first kind of chapter that we went over talked about introductory nervous system types of stuff, things like cells of the nervous system, action potential generation, kind of how the nervous system functions. Chapter 13 focused on the spinal cord, which we talked about on Thursday. And then today we're going to be talking about the brain and the cranial nerves, which is not a small topic. We've got a lot of kind of structural information that we'll be talking about today. And if you haven't heard me say this enough, a lot of anatomy and physiology is structure related to function. So we'll kind of be tying those things in. So we'll be talking about different brain structures and then their correlative functions. The first part of this lecture, part 1, is going to be probably more the brain. And then part 2 will be focusing more on the cranial nerves, which we kind of alluded to some of their functions when we talked about facial muscles, because they're innervating facial muscles and allowing us to make expressions. So look at there. Okay, the quick rundown as to your to-do list. Again, we're getting towards the end of the semester, so there's kind of a lot of things on this list right now. So make sure you're still watching these lectures, staying current on the information. You've got a quiz on Friday due. You have a pro section due this Friday as well. The pro section is anatomy kind of based, some function in there as well. After today, which I guess would be Friday, there's still 2 classes left next Thursday, Tuesday, and Thursday. The final is November 23rd from 3:20 to 5:20. They're going to be 80 multiple choice questions that are essentially cumulative, covering all of the material that we've covered in the course. We do have exam 3 on the 17th, which is you're watching this video next week, then it'll be the following week. Chapter 10 is the extra credit quiz and homework that's available on Wiley Plus. Each one of those is worth 10 points. And then also don't forget there's a writing assignment that is also worth 20 points of extra credit. That is due on the 13th as well. Make sure you submit it well before the 13th. If you have any questions about that writing assignment, there's kind of a quick description in the syllabus, but if you have more specific questions, always feel free to reach out and ask me, and I'm happy to answer those for you as well. Okay. So as per usual, we have the laundry list of study guide questions that you'll be answering when you come to class on Tuesday. So again, we'll be hitting a lot of different parts of the brain, the different functions of the brain, talking about sulci and gyri and lobes and nuclei and all of those fun things. Okay, so the main purposes of this chapter is to first understand how the brain is organized. So how is the whole thing kind of put together to function the way it does? How do we protect it? What are the different layers of protection? How does it get blood? Again, blood's going to be important because it's going to be bringing both nutrients and oxygen to our brain to allow for its function. If you remember when we were talking about action potential generation and kind of how neurons fire, remember that it just takes a ton of ATP to kind of keep those neurons happy. So getting glucose, which is kind of the, I want to say conduit of energy to the brain, is very important. So the blood system, blood supply allows for that to happen. We'll compare and contrast various areas of the brain and their functions, discuss the functional organization of the brain, kind of how everything is put together. And then lastly, like I said, kind of in probably part 2 here, we'll be talking about cranial nerve structure and function. Again, a lot of the cranial nerves right up here in the head and face. Okay, so brain organization, protection, and blood supply. So how do we get all these things? So when we talk about the brain, it's nice to kind of go back and kind of think of, okay, well, how did the brain start? How did it originate? When we're going through development, very early development, like what are those original structures that are giving rise to these far more complicated structures? So here you can see just a really quick synopsis. I mean, there are entire courses that are taught about neurodevelopment. So this is, again, very, very abbreviated information here. The development of the nervous system begins with a thickening of the ectoderm tube called the neural tube. So he was literally started as a tube. So here in a 3 to 4 week embryo, you have both a wall and a cavity. So it's kind of situated out into 3 different parts here from the beginning. You've got your proencephalon, senescephalon, and your mesencephalon, and then your rhombocephalon. And it's essentially correlates to things like your forebrain, your midbrain, and your hindbrain. Forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain, kind of how they're located across the brain in its fully formed state, kind of folds in on itself, and you get to your hindbrain kind of tucked underneath. Your midbrain is kind of in the middle, and then your forebrain's kind of all of that stuff on top, and we'll talk about what that stuff is actually called a little later on. We haven't defined it yet, though, so I'm not going to use that terminology. So this prosencephalon is going to essentially differentiate or change into the telencephalon. So you can start to see two different kind of almost what will look like eyeballs, but what there really are lobes of your brain that are starting to develop there. Now your telecephalon and your diencephalon, that's giving rise to the walls of things like your thalamus, your hypothalamus, and your epithalamus. We'll talk about all of these regions later on in this lecture, so it's a good kind of introduction to those terms. Your mesencephalon gives rise to your midbrain, and then your metencephalon and your myelencephalon give rise to things like your pons, your cerebellum, and your medulla oblongata. Again, we're going to be talking about each one of these structures later on in the course, so do not, or in this class essentially, so do not get bogged down too much here. Recognize that we'll just be talking about their function, and it's good to know kind of where those structures originate. So in the adult structures, they're derived from these essentially lateral ventricles. You have your third ventricle, your aqueduct to the midbrain, and your upper part of the fourth ventricle, and your lower part of the fourth ventricle. So these are all kind of the ventricles that are lining the inside of your brain. And when we talk about ventricles, we're essentially talking about holes, intentional holes in your brain that generate things like your cerebrospinal fluid. So your brain is not just a dense, compact thing of tissue. You've got these holes in your brain that give your brain the ability to make essentially liquid. That liquid bathes the brain, keeps it very happy. That cerebrospinal fluid that we've talked about. So these things called ventricles are essentially those holes that give rise to the regions around that in the adult form of the brain. Okay, so this is a very good, like, kind of 30,000 foot view of like, what does that brain actually look like? So let's go ahead and annotate here. Okay, so if we look at a sagittal section or a medial view of the brain, again, we say sagittal, we're slicing that brain just right down the middle here. And you can see kind of all this region that you see here. I think of what we think of when we think of the brain is called the cerebrum. The cerebrum has a lot of different functions. We'll talk about those functions based upon their location. You've got your frontal cortex here located near the front. You've got your occipital lobe here towards the back. We'll talk about what those do. We'll get there. You'll see that kind of in that diencephalon region here, you've got both the thalamus. You'll notice that kind of looks like a ball in the center of your brain, and your hypothalamus. Those both have very important functions in terms of regulating sensory information as well as homeostasis within the brain. You see the pineal gland, part of the epithalamus, kind of located right down there near the bottom. It's kind of hard to see when I'm drawing on it like this. And then we talk about the brainstem. The brainstem kind of has maybe some of the more homeostasis kind of like lizard brain types of functions. That's often what they call it, the lizard brain, because it doesn't have your higher cognitive functions that are required for things like talking and processing complex thoughts. These are just very menial basic tasks that the brainstem is important for. So you have parts of the brainstem, then your midbrain, your pons, your medulla oblongata, and then lastly, tucked underneath kind of a separate kind of structure from their cerebrum is you have your cerebellum, and so that's kind of located here. Cerebellum looks different in the structure that we see from the cerebrum. These neurons are kind of situated in a different manner. It's important for movement, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but again, it looks very different structurally than what we're seeing with the cerebellum. And lastly, you can see the extension of the spinal cord down here. So this is just very 30,000 foot view of like the different structures of the brain. And again, you have your cerebrum up here, your cerebellum back here, your diencephalon, which has your thalamus, your hypothalamus, your brainstem, which has both your midbrain and located here and here, your pons, again, kind of that's another kind of almost like ball-like structure tucked underneath the brain, and then also your medulla oblongata. So we'll talk about each one of these structures and their functions kind of as we go through this. So buckle up because you're going to hear these words multiple times throughout the lecture today, kind of again, where the structure is and then what it does. Okay, so the first part of this lecture is talking about coverings of the brain, what protects them, and what supplies blood. So in terms of protection, obviously your first line of protection here are going to be your cranial bones. So we talked a lot about the bones of the skull. We talked about how they're the different sutures that bring together those different bones of the skull, especially in the mature skull. And ultimately, like I said, kind of alluded to when we were talking about the skull, is that those different bones that we talked about generally correlate to the different lobes that we'll be discussing today. Underneath that skull, You have your cranial meninges. And again, when we talked about the spinal cord, we already kind of introduced the idea of the meninges, right? You have your pia, your arachnoid, and your dura mater. So there's three different kind of layers protecting the brain also exists. The pia is going to be the most closely associated with the brain tissue. And you've got your arachnoid kind of layered on top of that. And then your outermost, most kind of durable type of brain covering is going to be that dura mater. Cranial dura mater is composed of actually two layers, and we'll look at the structure of that here in another slide or two. And then lastly, the last thing that's going to be protecting the brain and causing it not to just bang right against that skull is your cerebrospinal fluid. So your brain's actually kind of just bathed in a whole liquid bath, and it's kind of allowing, like as you maybe shake your head side to side, not to have that tissue hit right up against the skull. You're kind of floating in cerebrospinal fluid that helps provide some cushioning. Again, when you talk about things of impact, things like traumatic brain injury, a lot of the injury is caused because your brain is hitting very hard against let's say a hard surface like your skull as it's whiplashing maybe back and forth. And so the cerebrospinal fluid can actually provide some cushioning from that, preventing that from happening. So again, these are kind of the different protection methods that the brain has. It's important that we protect our brain because it has so many different functions in our body. So when we look at the cranial bones and meninges, kind of a picture of what that looks like here, you can see the frontal plane, you've got that skull located on the outside. So here you can see the skin, a little layer of fat here underneath your scalp. You have your parietal bone. Again, you can see that suture that exists right there. And then if we go just kind of inferior to that, you can see the cranial meninges. So the outermost layer here is going to be that dura mater. Next, you have the arachnoid mater, as we kind of talked about when we're talking about the spinal cord coverings. The arachnoid mater kind of looks like a series of spider webs covering the brain because it also contains the vascularization to the brain, so that blood supply that's getting to the brain. So you can kind of see those little arachnoid villi. Those are going to be kind of blood supplies to the brain. And then just kind of very closely associated with the topical region of the cerebral cortex is that pia mater. It's very difficult to dissociate the pia mater from the brain because it's literally going into every little nook and crevice, aka sulci and gyri of that brain. So every little kind of dip and curve that you see within the brain, that pia mater is kind of working its way in. If we look at kind of the difference or the spaces between these different layers, you can see that you have your subarachnoid space, which is kind of between the pia mater and the arachnoid. And then you have your subdural space, which is going to be between your dura and your arachnoid. So there are those regions there. So sometimes you'll hear about a subdural hematoma. Could be types of the way damages are essentially reported, telling you where at in the brain layering system the damage has occurred. Okay, so extensions of the dura mater. So here again, you can see kind of a sagittal section of the entire head. You see the frontal bone here. Here you get more parietal. You have your falx calibrae, which is going to be kind of right down the center of that brain of the brain. You have your superior sagittal sinus. This is going to be just kind of another protective region of the brain, and your inferior sagittal sinus as well within that sagittal plane. And your straight sinus kind of a little bit further back there. These are going to be regions that are important for circulatory processes within the brain. And then lastly, you can see back here the occipital bone. You can see the interaction of the sphenoid bone here and kind of how that tucks right underneath kind of where the brain sits. When we look at the interior view of the frontal section here, you can see that superior sagittal sinus right next to the dura mater that you can see located here. The arachnoid mater is just, again, located within that region. You can see that some of that vasculature, that some of those veins and arteries that are located in that region, and then really close or really closely associated with that cerebral cortex, you see the pia mater. So again, this is kind of just, I think, a reiteration of the previous slide that we saw. It's pointing out some of the sinuses, but I'm not going to ask you too much about those. Okay, so blood flow to the brain. So blood flow to the brain via the vertebral and carotid arteries flows back to the heart via the jugular veins. So we're talking about circulation of blood flow. We haven't talked about the cardiovascular system in this particular class. It'll be something that you probably address next semester, but we are kind of talking about some veins and arteries that maybe you've heard of before just because they're pretty commonly used in the everyday vernacular. So again, blood flows to the brain via the vertebral and carotid arteries. And so if you have a nick in your carotid artery, obviously that's going to be fairly lethal because you're preventing blood flow to the brain, and then blood flows back to the heart via the jugular vein. So any type of damage to either the carotid or the jugular arteries and vein, respectively, can be pretty detrimental. Importance of blood flow to the brain. So the brain utilizes about 20% of the body's oxygen supply. So keeping your brain happy is important. If you do not provide the proper amount of oxygen to the brain, it's going to obviously result in a possible loss of consciousness. Interruption can lead to weakening, permanent damage, or even death of brain cells. They call this type of prevention of oxygen to the brain hypoxia. When the brain cell lacks the oxygen that it requires. Glucose is also, so it's obviously very important for the blood to be providing both oxygen and energy to the brain. So if you prevent blood flow, you're going to prevent both of those things from getting to the brain. Glucose is also, like I said before, very important gets to the brain because it's imperative that our brain cells have that energy to reestablish its resting membrane potential. And so if you don't have glucose getting to the brain, it can produce mental confusion, dizziness, convulsions, and even unconsciousness. So both of those things are important. So prevention of blood flow to the brain is highly detrimental. It's important that we get that blood flow to the brain. In terms of kind of how the brain protects itself, and we've been kind of talking about in terms of protection, the brain has essentially what's called the blood-brain barrier, or BBB. I kind of alluded to this a few lectures ago and how important the blood-brain barrier is. One of the reasons the blood-brain barrier is so important, or I guess the reason I think about it so often, is because there are a lot of drugs that could possibly be beneficial to the brain or to brain function. However, the big thing that the big reason that they aren't able to kind of do what they need to do is because they're unable to cross the blood-brain barrier. The blood-brain barrier, again, is just, it's like a huge wall that protects the brain, but can also prevent therapies from accessing the brain as well. So it prevents things like harmful substances and pathogens by serving as a selective barrier to prevent the passage, but the blood-brain barrier can prevent the entry of therapeutic drugs. And so when we talked about spinal access, that's one way in which you can kind of circumvent or get around the blood-brain barrier is by access by purging, or not purging, but kind of poking into the blood-brain barrier via that way. So that's one way in which we can access the blood-brain barrier. Injury to the brain may cause breakdown of the blood-brain barrier, and so if the blood-brain barrier becomes more permeable, there are instances where that happens, and you can have more invaders kind of come into the system that you wouldn't want there per se. So normally restricted substances would enter the brain tissue. So different things can essentially change the permissiveness of things to cross the blood-brain barrier. But again, from a therapeutic standpoint, it's something to very, very much take into account and think about. Okay. I've talked about cerebrospinal fluid a couple different times. Once in terms of the types of protection that it involves to the brain. It protects the brain and the spinal cord against chemical and physical injuries. Again, it's kind of just like that buffer, that liquid buffer around our nervous system, and it carries oxygen, glucose, and other important substances to the blood, from the blood to the nervous cell tissue. So this whole brain here is essentially getting bathed in cerebrospinal fluid. It's got all the ions that the brain needs. It has the glucose that the brain needs. It's important that it's constantly bathing the brain so the brain can carry out its normal function. So where does this cerebrospinal fluid come from? Like, where does it originate from? Like, how does it get into our bodies? It doesn't kind of get into our bodies. It's actually generated here in our ventricles. And so when I talked earlier about these kind of holes in our brain, those holes are called ventricles. And so here we can see an example of the left lateral ventricle. Here we see the third ventricle. You can see the fourth ventricle here down kind of near the brainstem. And again, these are essentially holes in the brain that are able to generate cerebrospinal fluid, and that cerebrospinal fluid serves multiple functions as we're talking about here. in the brain. So ventricles produce cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. Specifically, there are cells that line the ventricles that produce the cerebrospinal fluid. So the cells that kind of carry out this purpose are called the choroid plexus. And so if we look at, again, this is a great example or cross section showing you these holes or ventricles that are inside the brain. And you can see, and if you kind of zoom in really close to like what the walls of those holes look like, you can see that they're ependymal cells here, right? And that they are they're actually producing that cerebrospinal fluid and creating that cerebrospinal fluid that you see here. So there are these tight junctions. They're essentially producing or excreting the cerebrospinal fluid and allowing for it to bathe and exist kind of all within this hole that we see, this ventricle that we see within the brain. So these ependymal cells are connected via tight junctions. You've got this blood capillary shown of the choroid plexus. So as the cerebrospinal fluid is essentially being made, it's kind of getting infused with the nutrients and ions and energy that are required for the brain to be super happy. You can see here also that there are the different layers. You can see the pia mater that is represented there. Again, it's going to be tightly associated with the very surface of the neuronal layer. So again, just recognize that the choroid plexus makes CSF, cerebrospinal fluid. I'm not going to ask you about these other structures that are kind of listed on this particular image. Okay, so that cerebrospinal fluid has a very specific pattern in which it flows throughout the brain. So that's what this particular image is showing you here, is that we've got your choroid plexus, again, primarily in that large lateral ventricle. And so here you have heart and lungs. You've got that blood that's flowing out and again, providing that oxygen and the essentially energy and nutrients that the body needs to survive. So it's that blood's going to go to the fourth ventricle choroid plexus, the third ventricle choroid plexus, and the lateral ventricle choroid plexus. So it's going to go to those cells that I just showed you there. And each one of those, against ventricles, are going to be generating CSF, and then that CSF is going to essentially go to the lateral ventricle, through the intraventricular foramen, to the third ventricle, through the aqueduct of the midbrain, to the fourth ventricle, through the lateral and median apertures, to the subarachnoid space and the arachnoid villi of dural and venous sinuses. So you can kind of just see the different flow patterns here as that is being generated, the way the central cerebrospinal fluid, as it gets generated, it's flowing, and then it kind of makes its final exit through the sinuses that we see here, and it goes back down and gets kind of essentially recycled. I'm not going to be asking you too much about kind of the flow patterns of the CSF. I think it's just important for you to recognize that the blood is going to those choroid plexus of those ventricles, essentially giving the CSF its like nutrient charge and oxygenation charge. And then once that CSF is made, it's circulating through the brain and then kind of making its exit strategy through the sinuses, and then essentially entering back into the ventricles to get recharged with the nutrients that are being provided via the blood supply. Very much another kind of vantage point of this, giving you an ability to see where those ventricles are located at. So again, you have your frontal plane kind of cutting through the brain. You can see the lateral ventricle here. It does look like just a huge gaping hole in the center of your brain. Down below that, you're inferior to that, you see your third ventricle. Here you have your fourth ventricle. And then here's what's called the aqueduct of the midbrain that kind of joins together those two regions. So again, each one of those ventricles is connected as the cerebrospinal fluid kind of flows through them. And they're kind of bathing all of those very central important structures of the brain that you can see here that are lining that. Things like the cerebellum, this cerebrum obviously is going to be important, and a lot of the midbrain is also going to be present here. So just again, another opportunity to see where those holes or ventricles are located within the brain. Okay, so again, if you're a video person, by all means watch these videos. So let's go ahead and kind of progress through the brainstem and the reticular formation. Okay, so the brain stem, again, is kind of considered like the old brain, carries out some of the more simpler functions that we're able to do with the brain. You have composed of three different regions here, the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. And so if we look again at this structure here, we've essentially flipped the brain upside down and we're looking at the inferior aspect of the brain. And you can see that there are all these cranial nerves kind of hanging out here. But if we focus on exactly what we're listing here, here you have the medulla oblongata present here. You have the pons that's superior to that. That's this region here. And then we move up to the midbrain, which is kind of located in this particular region. So it's all kind of part of that stem that extends up from the spinal cord. So here you can see the base of the spinal cord and how each one of these regions kind of extends up from that. So you can see base of the spinal cord, medulla oblongata, your pons, and then your midbrain. These are all going to be the components of the brainstem. And again, that's the major kind of component here that we're checking out. Other things to kind of note from this particular vantage point that we're not really discussing right now, but here you can see olfactory bulbs, which are kind of interesting little bulbs that extend out from the base of your brain that allow you to smell. And then we have things like your optic tract, which are going to be getting your essentially vision input in the processing. But we'll get to a place where we're talking about those sensory system nerves here in a bit. So again, just focus primarily on the brainstem. Okay, so again, video, very you, sure. Okay, so the medulla oblongata, so if we break down each one of these components of the brainstem, so it's continuous with the superior aspect of the spinal cord. So again, you can see the spinal cord kind of feeding up there. And you have these different kind of pyramids kind of in the most, I guess, anterior portion of this. And so it contains portions of both the motor and the sensory tracts. So again, as you're getting all of that information up through your spinal cord, it's important to kind of just continue to think about where that's running, right? So you've got your spinal cord sending sensory information up, and then you've got motor information kind of coming down from your cerebellum. And so those tracks, if that's kind of where it's coming from, it also has to be running through the medulla oblongata. You can see other nerves are interacting here, things like the vagus nerve on both sides. And then you can also see here that fourth ventricle that's going to be kind of in a proximity to the medulla oblongata, providing the nutrients that particular region needs to function. The cranial nerves that are interacting with that particular region, the vestibulocochlear nerve, it's going to be important for hearing. The hypoglossal, that's going to be important for tongue movement. Structural regions, I pointed out the pyramids. You also have the inferior olivary nuclei. I'm not going to be asking you about these subregions of this particular structure. I'll just be asking you about the overall structure. And in terms of the function, it's important for, again, those very primary functions, the lizard brain functions, things like heart rate, respiratory rate, vasoconstriction, swallowing, coughing, vomiting, sneezing, and hiccuping. Things, again, that don't take a ton of kind of higher cognitive processing, more just kind of taking care of business type of region of the brain. The pons, so if we move inferior, superior, kind of up the brain stem, you can see the pons here. So medulla oblongata down here. You have your pons located here, and it's superior to the medulla oblongata and is linked to the parts of the brain one another by way of tracts. And so you've got a lot of white matter kind of running through that particular region. You can see the pons again is kind of a part of the highway of processing from kind of the spinal cord up into the other regions of the brain. And so you can see as these arrows are indicating kind of the projection from the pons to these higher level cortices. Okay, so again, the nerves that are kind of associated with that particular region, the trigeminal, abducens, spatial, vestibular branch of the vestibulocochlear. We'll talk about what all of these cranial nerves do in part 2 of this lecture, so don't get too bogged down in them now. In terms of the functional regions, it relays nerve impulses to the voluntary skeletal muscle movement. So it's, again, part of that superhighway projecting to the sensory systems in the motor cortexes, and pneumotaxic and apneustic areas. So it essentially controls breathing or respiration. So again, very basic kind of functions of the brainstem. The brainstem doesn't do a lot of higher order cognitive processing. It's just basically like, let's take care of business. What do we need to do to survive? Things like breathing are important. So the pons is going to mediate that particular process. Okay. Next, again, kind of moving inferior to superior of that brainstem. The midbrain is located superior to the medulla oblongata and extends from the pons to the diencephalon. So here you can see essentially that the superior part of of the midbrain, and you have your thalamus up here, which we'll talk about a little bit more in depth. Things like your pineal gland, super important gland that we'll be talking about at some point in time. And again, things like your tectum, just inferior to that, both your superior and inferior colliculi. You can see those kind of two little, almost look like balls there. And then also as we move down, we can see some protrudences from your cerebrum that are also part of this midbrain section. So it's important to recognize that there are many cranial nerves that are interacting here. And then we also have things like the walls of the floor of the fourth ventricle. Again, recognizing that the ventricles are kind of interacting with each of these regions as well. Okay, so the cranial nerves that are important or innervating this particular brain region are going to be the ocular, motor, and trochlear. Again, we'll talk about what these cranial nerves do in part 2. The structural regions, we talked about the cerebral peduncles, the corpora quadra regionuma, the substantia nigra, the red nuclei, and the medial lemniscus. These are all going to be important, maybe nuclei of regions for sending out neurotransmitters, but I don't know if we'll get to that particular level of specificity. And then the functional regions, it's going to convey motor impulses from the cerebrum and cerebellum and spinal cord, send sensory impulses from the spinal cord to the thalamus, and regulates auditory and visual reflexes. So you recognize here it's kind of a part of the superhighway tract, sending motor and visual and sensory information to and from the brain, and then also plays a role in things like auditory and visual reflexes. And so there's some processing going on from other sensory systems that we haven't really hit upon in some of the other regions that we've talked about. So we're not seeing as much auditory and sensory information being processed in, let's say, the pons for the medulla oblongata. The reticular formation. So if we look here, we can see the reticular formation. Circling it right here. Reticular formation and where it's located. So it's kind of this purple region that we see here. It helps regulate muscle tone, alerts the cortex to incoming sensory signals, and responsible for maintaining consciousness and awakening from sleep. So again, very basic functions to maintain homeostasis. It's responsible for maintaining consciousness, which seems to be an important thing, as well as awake sleep cycle as well. So the reticular formation, although we're not going to talk a ton about it, does have some pretty critical roles in the brain. Okay, so as our book likes to do, we talk about it in a series of images, and then we kind of put it all together in a table, which again, if you study like that, it's perfect. This just kind of condenses all of the information we just talked about, what the function is of the medulla oblongata. So it kind of gives you the whole rundown, both you've got sensory ascending and descending tracts that are being sent to and from, cardiovascular mediation, respiratory center together with the pons. So it's going to be important for regulating breathing. You've got some components of the sensory pathway that are coming in via several different nuclei. It also is important for, again, these very basic responses that we might have to our environment. And then we also talk here about the origin of several different cranial nerves that we'll be discussing in part 2. So again, if we think about the medulla oblongata, let's just keep it very basic, saying, it's getting information to and from sensory and motor systems, and then mediates very primary functions in the body. The pons contain sensory and motor tracts, as we saw before, has vestibular nuclei along with the medulla that are part of the equilibrium pathway to the brain, and again helps control breathing, and then has nuclei for several different cranial nerves. Lastly, the midbrain contains sensory and motor tracts that we've seen with the other parts of the brainstem. but also plays a little bit more of a role with coordinating sensory information from things like the head, the eyes, and the trunk to visual stimuli. So you do have a little bit more higher order processing happening here because it's allowing the brain to take in visual information and coordinate movements to a certain extent. The substantia nigra, which is a very important nuclei for some disease states, and the red nucleus contribute to this movement and contains a nuclei for the oculomotor and trochlear nerves. And again, when we get to talking about these specific cranial nerves, you'll see kind of how they feed back into this role that it has with coordinating eye responses with movement. Okay, the cerebellum. So we talked about kind of, you have the brainstem, you have your cerebrum, and then you have your cerebellum. So your cerebellum's back here at the very base of your brain, and it occupies the inferior and posterior aspects of the cranial cavity. It consists of two kind of hemispheres and a central vermis. You'll see that when we talk about the cerebrum, it also has two hemispheres. You know, they kind of mirror one another, although the functions on each hemisphere might slightly differ. This cerebellum also kind of has that two hemispheric kind of structure. If we look kind of again down the center of that, if we talk about the center kind of lining, we've got the vermis, you've got your posterior lobe and your anterior lobe of the cerebrum. Again, this is just kind of a different vantage point. I'm not going to ask you too much about the peduncles. Kind of a fun word to say, though. I'm going to ask you probably more about the vermis and then just kind of the location of the cerebellum. Okay, the function of the cerebellum. One of the major functions is to coordinate motor movement. And again, you can see here that the structure of it looks very different than what we see with the cerebrum. The cerebellum has a lot of gray matter, not a ton of white matter, but is important for muscle contractions and the maintenance of normal muscle tone, posture, and balance. Again, I have a 9-month-old right now that's trying to learn how to walk. I keep looking at it and thinking, your cerebellum must be doing a ton of work right now trying to figure this out. You can see its relationship, the cerebellum, to the region we just spoke about, the brainstem. And so you can see that cerebellum is pretty closely interacting with things like the pons and the superior colliculus, and then you can see the pineal gland. But again, the cerebellum, you know, it has these kind of different lobes to it, but I'm not going to ask you too much about those lobes. Just know the general function of the cerebellum. Okay, the diencephalon. Okay, so the diencephalon is kind of an extension, kind of the more superior portion that we see extending up from the brainstem. So here you can see the diencephalon has these components. You have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then the pineal gland. So the pineal gland is going to be part of the epithalamus. The hypothalamus is going to be located just kind of, I guess, superior to that. And then even more superior to that is your thalamus. The thalamus, I think of as, I keep using the term superhighway, but this is really kind of the connection center for everything. A lot of things go through the thalamus, and we'll kind of talk about that when we get to that particular slide. But this is all the part of the diencephalon. So you've got your brainstem, and then you've got your diencephalon, and then you have your cerebellum, and then you have your cerebrum. So these are kind of the different sections of the brain as we break them down. Okay, so the thalamus. Again, the thalamus just super important to the brain and is just like a major highway. So here you can see the thalamus and how it's kind of centered in the very middle of the brain. So you can think of something that's located in the center. It's probably very important. It's got all of these regions around it that are essentially protecting it. This particular figure is interesting because it's pointing out things like the central sulcus. We'll talk about the central sulcus and kind of what this particular kind of just swath of neurons, what their functions are. So it's located superior to the midbrain and contains nuclei that serve as relay stations for all sensory systems except for smell. So every other sensory system that you have, right? Taste, vision, touch, all of those things are getting relayed through the thalamus. That's how important it is. So, and it's sending it to the cerebral cortex. So basically everything's kind of coming in, going to the thalamus, and then kind of going out to the cerebellum. So interestingly, you know, scientists love to show you this is exactly where this is happening. So here you can see the organization of exactly where the different regions are. of the thalamus that are projecting to different regions of the cerebrum. Again, I'm not going to ask you about this because I think it's kind of outside the purview of specificity of this course. However, recognize that they do have that level of organization, and as long as you know what the thalamus does, I'll be a happy camper. Okay, moving on to the hypothalamus. So we just talked about the thalamus, kind of that's more superior. Inferior to that is the hypothalamus, and has 4 major regions. And again, the hypothalamus, super important region of the brain, controls, I like how they just say, many of the body's activities. Very true. And is one of the major regulators of homeostasis. And so you can see of these regions, you have kind of your mammillary region, your tuberal region, your supraoptic region, and your preoptic region. And so you see the word optic, you should think vision. Yes, that's in fact true. It's part of kind of a location of sending signals to the different visual areas. Oh my gosh, suprachiasmatic nucleus, yay! Super optic nucleus. Again, everywhere you see optic, that's going to be related to the eye. I'm again not going to ask you about each one of these nuclei here. We might talk about some of the functions of them as we talk more about the functions of the brain. But again, just recognize hypothalamus, major regulator of homeostasis. The epithalamus lies superior and posterior to the thalamus and contains the pineal gland, secretes melatonin, and the habicular nuclei are involved in olfaction. So we talked about how smell wasn't processed through the thalamus. The epithalamus is going to be the region that's important for the processing of olfaction. Secretes melatonin. So when we think about kind of what melatonin does, it can be involved in things like sleep and wake cycles. And so the pineal gland is important for that part of the process. Circumventricular organs are CVOs of the diencephalon. So parts of the diencephalon, the CVOs can monitor chemical changes in the blood because they lack a blood-brain barrier. So that's one region of the brain that's kind of exposed. Include a portion of the hypothalamus and the pineal gland. I don't think I'm going to ask you too much about CVOs. Okay. Unfortunately, I'm in the middle of recording right now, and we are about 10 slides short, but I have another meeting that I have to go to, so I'm going to pause. And this video is going to have to be a 2-parter, so I apologize. We'll pick up here talking about CVOs and then kick off talking about the cerebrum because I don't want to rush through that too fast, but because it's fun. So again, this is going to be a 2-parter, so stay tuned.